The story of the overturning circulation actually starts way back in 1751. So there was a Reverend Stephen Hales who had been following what Benjamin Franklin had been doing in terms of charting the Gulf Stream waters. But he realized that nobody, as far as he knew, had ever taken the temperature of the very deep ocean waters. So he asked a British sea captain named Henry Ellis to stop in transit on one of his next voyages and take measurements of the temperature depth. So on his next voyage, Henry Ellis and his crew were transiting across what was then called the torrid zone, the very hot, tropical waters in the Atlantic. And they stopped to take this temperature measurement that Stephen Hales had asked for. And all they had was a simple wooden bucket that was fitted with valves at the top and the bottom in order to capture water at specific depths. And they had a very, very long wooden rope. And so what they did is they first lowered that wooden bucket over the side, they would hauled it back up, and then with a very small thermometer, in the letter they talk about this thermometer of Mr. Fahrenheit's made by Mr. Bird. They put the thermometer in the wooden bucket, they measure the temperature, they record it, and then they lower it back at a deeper depth. And so they repeat this laboriously over and over again, and they keep recording the temperature when they bring the bucket back up. And in his letter back to Stephen Hales, Henry Ellis writes that, as expected, the temperature decreased proportional to depth till we lowered it to 3,900 feet, and though we kept lowering it below that, the temperature would decrease no further. And then at the end of his letter, he wrote, "I'm not sure how much of this is of interest to you," he said, "but for our part, we're vastly pleased that we have found these source of cold waters to cool our wines and to cool our baths at our pleasure." So that letter went to Reverend Stephen Hales in 1751. As far as we know, he didn't do much with it other than to send it on to the Royal Society of London, where in 1800, Count Rumford came across this letter. Now, Count Rumford, many people know about Count Rumford because of convection, and people know about Rumford fireplaces. But Count Rumford at that time was very interested in what's called convection, heat convection. So when he looked at this letter, he was very puzzled because he couldn't figure out how those waters in the tropical ocean got so cold. So what he surmised from that one single profile of temperature was that those deep waters must have had their origin at the high latitudes in the North Atlantic or in the Antarctic. And so he wrote two sentences which describe the ocean's overturning circulation in 1800. He said, "I doubt there could be any other supposition that these deep cold waters in the tropics originated from cold currents at the surface in the high latitudes, and then we must have warm surface waters returning to high latitudes." And so it's really, to me, I love that story because it's sort of like every scientist's dream to take like one piece of data that just changes the conception, because at that time everybody was following the surface ocean circulation, like I mentioned about Benjamin Franklin, but nobody really thought the deep ocean was anything other than completely still and void of life. So it was really something quite novel to think that there was this overturning circulation.